Okay, so, you've been sending us a lot of interesting stuff about, defense acquisition.
Right.
And you're really looking to dig into one specific recommendation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Today we are going deep on Section 316 of the Forged Act.
That's right. Section 316, all about mandating competitive prototyping within the Department of Defense.
Huge.
And, this is just one piece of the puzzle, right? We're doing this whole series on the recommendations from the Forged Act. So think of this like one, important piece.
Yeah, one piece of the larger picture.
Exactly.
And our goal today is to help you understand this recommendation and then start thinking about, how to prepare for it.
Yeah, make it real.
Exactly, make it real. So we're going to be working off of the document excerpt that you sent.
Okay.
And from that, it looks like the big thing is that by April 1st, 2025, service and component acquisition executives have to establish competitive prototyping for at least 3 programs annually per service.
Yeah, and they have to have, these parallel development efforts, separate program managers, separate contracting officers for each prototype. It's pretty intense.
That's a lot.
And then, of course, they have this big independent down select, and that could then lead to a sole source follow-on contract.
Wow, so big changes. It's important to keep in mind that the mitigations and measures of success that we're going to talk about are suggested by the reviewer.
Right.
And the alternative approaches are potential alternative approaches. So, just kind of framing that up as we go into this.
Yeah, we're not just gonna read this thing. We're gonna talk about what it means, why it's happening now, what the potential issues might be, and how the DoD thinks they're gonna solve those issues.
Love it. So let's start by just really breaking down the mandate.
Okay.
Okay, so April 1, 2025, that's the deadline.
Yep, coming up quick.
That's when these prototyping efforts need to be running. And it's not just a one-time thing, right? It's at least 3 programs per service every year.
Right, pretty big change.
Big change.
Yeah.
And then the way it's structured, like you were saying, it's really important to have separate program managers, separate contracting officers for each competing prototype within the program.
Right, yeah, so that's really designed to keep those development paths totally independent.
Totally separate, yeah.
For a fair evaluation.
Yeah, and then they'll do that independent down select, and that's not based on, who you've worked with before. It's all about who has the best prototype.
Exactly right.
And what I thought was really interesting is that even after this competitive stage, there's still the possibility of a sole source follow-on contract.
Yeah, so it's like you win this huge competition to get to this bigger agreement.
Huge competition, exactly.
Exactly.
And, this idea of competition, it's not new, right? This has been something that's been talked about in acquisition reform for a really long time.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the source material even mentions the Packer Commission from 1986.
Wow, way back.
Yeah, so this idea that competition is good for defense procurement, it's been around.
And the GAO, they've always, been worried about cost overruns and schedule delays when you just rely on one contractor.
Of course, yeah.
So they've been pushing for parallel development.
For a long time.
And you can see how this has evolved, right? So the 2016 NDAA introduced middle-tier acquisition.
Right, trying to speed things up.
Exactly.
And it didn't have this, structured competition that we see in Section 316.
Right, and then you see the influence of, DARPA,
yeah,
which has a long history of using competitive prototyping.
Exactly. They've been doing this for a long time.
And just recently, Senator Wicker introduced the Forged Act on December 19, 2024.
Right.
So this is really formalizing that competitive prototyping approach.
It's like making it law.
Exactly.
Putting it down on paper.
So, the source material also talks about these desired effects of the recommendation.
Yeah.
So why are we doing all of this?
Right. Well, the first one is fostering innovation.
Okay.
So when you've got these multiple teams tackling the same problem in different ways, you're just going to get more new ideas.
Right.
You're exploring a wider range of possibilities.
More creative solutions.
Exactly.
Cool. So the second one is speeding up acquisition timelines.
Right. So the idea is that you can actually get to that deployable capability faster if you're running these parallel paths.
So you're doing a lot at the same time.
Exactly.
Cool. And the third one is improving quality.
Yeah. So because you've got these competing prototypes, you can actually put them in front of the warfighters.
Get their feedback.
Exactly. And then you can pick the best one based on, how it performs in the real world.
So you're not just looking at it on paper, you're seeing how it actually works.
Exactly right.
That's great.
And then you can reduce risk.
Okay.
Because if one prototype fails, you've got backups.
It's like having a plan B.
Exactly.
Nice. So the fourth one is risk reduction.
Right.
Okay. And then the fifth one.
Enhanced efficiency. So they're actually talking about exempting these programs from some of the normal bureaucratic requirements.
So like cutting through the red tape.
Exactly.
Love it.
Yeah, trying to speed things up.
So, obviously there are potential downsides to anything.
Of course, right.
So the document outlines some potential negative impacts.
Yeah, let's hear them.
So the first one is probably the most obvious: increased costs.
Makes sense. You've got multiple prototypes that you're funding.
More expensive up front.
Exactly.
Okay, so second potential problem is bias in the down select process.
Yeah, even with the best intentions, people might be inclined to favor a specific prototype
Right.
or a contractor they already know.
Yeah.
Or one that seems less risky.
So it's hard to be totally objective.
Right, exactly.
Okay, the third potential negative impact is overstretched resources.
Yeah, the Lowe's workforce is already stretched thin.
Right.
And their budgets are limited.
So doing all these competitive prototyping efforts at the same time
Could be too much.
could be too much.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the fourth one,
Is this potential exemption from JTIDs?
the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System.
Right.
And, I mean, this is meant to speed things up.
Right.
But it could mean that the prototypes aren't aligned with, like, strategic needs.
Yeah, you could end up with this amazing technology.
That doesn't actually fit in.
Doesn't solve the right problem.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last one.
The sole source follow-on contracts.
Right, so even though there's that initial competition,
If the winner gets a sole source contract later.
it could kind of defeat the purpose.
Exactly.
Right, so they're not incentivized to innovate anymore.
Exactly.
So the document talks about mitigations the organization will take to diminish the negative impacts.
Okay, so they're thinking about these problems.
Exactly.
What are they going to do?
So to deal with the increased costs, they want to put caps on prototype funding.
Okay, so set a budget.
Right.
Makes sense.
For bias in the down select, they want to use blinded evaluation criteria.
Interesting. So the evaluators wouldn't know who made which prototype.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, to handle the overstretched resources, they want to prioritize resource allocation for programs where competitive prototyping makes the most sense.
Okay, so focus on where it's going to have the biggest impact.
Right. And for strategic alignment, even with the JCI's exemption.
They want to do strategic alignment reviews before prototyping.
So basically a checkpoint to make sure everything's on track.
I like it.
Yeah.
Check it in.
And then to deal with the reduced long-term competition, they're talking about requiring periodic recompetition.
Okay, so even after a company wins, they have to keep competing.
Right, keep them on their toes.
Exactly.
So who's going to be most affected by all of this?
Who are the key players?
Well, first off, service and component acquisition executives, they're going to have a lot more oversight responsibility.
You're right. They're going to be making the big decisions.
Right, like who gets to do competitive prototyping.
Exactly.
And program managers, their roles are going to change a lot.
Right.
They're going to have to learn how to manage these competitive programs.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right, and the source document even mentions, like, a commitment to a certain tenure.
So they can see it through.
Yeah, they can't just jump ship.
Exactly.
Contracting officers, they're going to be busy.
Yeah, they might have to manage multiple contracts at the same time.
Right, so that's going to be tough.
Yeah.
And then operational test and evaluation staff, they're going to have a bigger role too.
Right, because they're the ones who are actually assessing these prototypes.
They're gathering the data.
Exactly.
So their input is going to be really important.
Super important.
So, not everyone's going to be happy about this.
Of course, right? Change is hard.
So who's going to be opposed and why?
Yeah, well, large defense contractors, they might not be thrilled.
Right, because they might lose out on those big sole source contracts.
Yeah, they're used to having a monopoly.
Exactly.
So it's going to shake things up.
And even program managers, they might be resistant.
Yeah, it's more work for them.
More stress.
And that tenure requirement.
Yeah, they can't just move on to a new program.
It's a big commitment.
And then congressional budget overseers.
Yeah, they might be worried about the upfront costs.
Yeah.
Even if it saves money in the long run.
They're focused on the short term.
Exactly.
So the document also mentions these additional resources that are going to be needed.
Okay, so what do they need?
Well, first off, money to fund all of these prototypes.
Right, can't do it without funding.
Training for program managers and contracting officers.
Right, they need to learn these new skills.
Exactly.
To manage competition. And then more personnel.
Yeah, you're going to need more people to handle the workload.
Okay, so how are we going to know if this is working?
Yeah, what are the metrics?
So the document lists some measures of success.
And remember, these are suggested by the reviewer.
That's right.
Okay.
So first, they're looking at prototype completion rates.
Okay.
They want 90% of prototypes to be completed on schedule.
So they're serious about staying on track.
Exactly.
Second, they want to look at down select timeliness.
Okay.
They want that to be done within 6 months after the evaluation.
So they want to move quickly.
Yeah.
Once the prototypes are done.
And then the most important measure is fielded capability improvements.
Right. That's the whole
Yeah.
point.
Make things better.
And they want to see a 20% performance gain.
That's ambitious.
It is ambitious.
But it's good to have goals.
And these measures are going to be tracked after 2025
Okay.
to see how it's all going.
Long-term view.
Exactly. I like it.
So are there other ways to do this?
Yeah. What about the alternative approaches?
So remember, these are potential alternatives.
Gotcha.
So one idea is voluntary competitive prototyping pilot programs.
Okay. So test it out before making it mandatory.
Exactly. See how it works.
Small scale.
Exactly.
Yeah. I like it.
And then the other idea is to use more simulation tools.
Ah, so instead of building the actual prototypes, you simulate them.
Right?
Which can save money.
Yeah.
And time and
So big takeaway, Section 316 of the Forged Act. This is a huge push for competitive prototyping.
a big shift.
And the goal is to, be more innovative, speed things up, and get better capabilities.
Right, for the warfighter.
But there are challenges, cost bias, resources, long-term competition.
Right, those are big issues.
And the DoD has some ideas about how to address those.
Hopefully they work.
So for you, whether you're in defense acquisition or you're just following it, you need to understand this.
This is a big change.
This is a big change.
Not a small tweak.
So think about it. Will this actually lead to the innovation and efficiency that they want?
Good question.
And what are the key indicators that you should be watching?
Right, what are the signs of success?
So remember, this is just one piece of the Forged Act.
Right, we're going to be covering all of it.
So stay tuned.
Absolutely.
And here's something to think about. With all this emphasis on competition up front, how's that going to affect the defense industrial base?
That is a good question.
Will it lead to more diversity, more small companies getting involved, or will the big companies still dominate?
It's going to be interesting to see.
It is. Thanks for joining us
Thanks for having me.
for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.